Hi, everyone. So, introducing Samantha. Samantha Power is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Law School. From 2013 to 2017, Sam served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and a member of President Obama's cabinet. Before that, she served on the National Security Council as a special assistant to the president for multilateral affairs and human rights. Sam began her career as a journalist, reporting from places such as Bosnia, East Timor, Kosovo, Rwanda, Sudan, Zimbabwe, and she was the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School. Sam's first book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, which had trouble getting a publisher, went on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 2003. Her next book, Chasing the Flame, One Man's Fight to Save the World, was a New York Times bestseller. And most recently, she's come out to great acclaim with The Education of an Idealist, a memoir, which we're going to talk together about now. And I'm going to add, Samantha is also a great friend. I was thinking back in preparation for our talk today to all the times our paths crossed over the years. And one thing that popped into my head, as if it had happened yesterday, although it was 15 years ago, is myself sitting in a hotel in Caracas, Venezuela. I was trying to report and write stories from there while my first marriage was falling apart. And Samantha would reach out to me with hilarious/pathetic text basically every day, filled with stories of her own relationship disasters, real, made up, who knows, just so as to provide me company in my misery and make me feel a little bit less alone and a little bit better. And that gives you a sense of this woman. She's empathetic and loyal, and she's not too self-conscious, and she's a doer. So Samantha, who I've not spoken to or seen for eons, this is a great occasion and a big pleasure to have this half hour in which to catch up with you and ask some questions. Thank you for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. I had blocked out those disastrous relationship experiences of my own, so thank you for reminding me.
I was going to go on and on, but I decided no. So I'm going to start with a really big question, which is, we are not living in the greatest of times. We're living in times of a pandemic. We're in arguably an unprecedented ongoing outrage over racial injustice and police brutality. And there's demonstrations that are getting bigger and bigger, even as police violence is also getting bigger. Many of us have questions about our leadership's ability to lead at all. And it seems we're more divided and shrill and mean to one another than ever. We're not managing to talk to each other, feel for each other, even agree with each other on what facts are and what's happening. And all this leads, I think, for many all over the world to feel confused and mainly overwhelmed. So this goes to my first question to you, which is, what have you learned and what do you advise when it comes to taking action at a time when things are so overwhelming? And I'm asking you this because one of my favorite themes from your book is about learning to bite off what you think you can chew. You talk about better is good. You talk about small solutions to big problems, and you talk about something called shrinking the change. So I'd love to hear from you about that way of looking at the world and maybe get some sort of guidance for young people and for all people, for myself as well, who need it right now more than ever.
Thank you, Danna. It's not a high point in human history right now. I actually think of all the dimensions of the current challenges, the one that stands out as being in some ways the most demoralizing, not because it is atop some hierarchy of terribleness, but because it's the foundation for making progress on everything else, is the sort of post-truth moment, the lack of an evidentiary basis. So when you see statistics on police violence that you and I may be horrified by, and on racial injustice, whether in terms of inclusion or in terms of violence and brutality against people of color, in order for us to develop some consensus about how to deal with that, we need a shared factual basis, a shared factual predicate. And so the fact that we've moved into these media silos and these echo chambers is really worrying in terms of, again, making the kind of change that is being pleaded for and shouted for now all around the world, including in every major American city. The concepts that you mentioned are sort of where I landed after years of trying to make a small difference, whether as a journalist or as an activist, or then most recently in government. I fastened on this idea that comes from a book called Switch by Dan and Chip Heath. And the book talks about this idea of shrinking the change. It makes exactly your point, which is when you feel overwhelmed, whether by climate change, by racial injustice, by inequality, by mass migration, by xenophobia in your politicians, the temptation is to think that we have to come up with a solution as big as the problems that we know are around us. And yet, since none of us is capable of a solution that big, at least anytime soon, you quickly sort of say, well, I tried, didn't work. Now I'm just going to go watch the new Michael Jordan documentary again and again and again. And whereas if you can just acknowledge that big changes often come from a set of small changes sort of accreted over time, or small changes that give rise to a cascade, you're much more likely to stay in the fight and in the game. And it can be more of a virtuous cycle than one of feeling, as you say, disempowered or small. And so I think there are countless examples of this. I mean, and in the current protest circumstance that we find ourselves in, one of the things that is happening all around the United States, I don't know if anything comparable is happening in other countries where racial injustice is also being protested, both in solidarity, I think, with the United States and because of racism everywhere. But one of the things that's happening, Donna, is that people are registering voters, alongside the marches themselves. There are actual booths that have been set up where people are being asked not only to protest, but to actually channel their grievances into pursuing change through elections. And that's really hard, particularly for people of color who've been shut out of elections through these draconian voter suppression laws or voter ID requirements. It's hard for them to take that leap of faith. But to marry activism with politicization, and with actually taking that leap of faith and investing in the political process, that's how change has happened in the past. And that's such a small act, and it feels so modest compared to, individuals being effectively murdered on camera before our eyes. But if every single marcher were to take that step and were to navigate the Byzantine requirements that have been put in front of them to try to impede their enfranchisement, we would see a sea change in terms of who actually occupies positions of authority in this country.
That's a very strong statement. Thanks, Sam. It's not really a follow-up, but it does connect to it. It's one of the dualities I found really interesting in the book, and I would love to hear some more about, was your relationship during your years as the U.S. ambassador to the UN with the Russian ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin. So on the one hand, it seems clear to me that you liked him a lot personally. You went to the theater together, you talked sports, you even invited him to the Holy of Holies, Thanksgiving at your mom and Eddie's home. And when he died suddenly on the eve of his 65th birthday, you tweeted that you were devastated. And then again, in the UN, some of your choicest words and harshest criticism were reserved for the country he was there to represent, and in whose name he stood and also lied more than once. Famously, you said, "Have you no shame?" You said that to him in the Security Council. So my question, again, it connects to the first question, is how is it possible to properly listen to and even admire someone whose positions you can't bear or fathom? How do we do that? And why do so few of us want or manage to do that?
Well, first, Donna, maybe I just say a word on the choice I made, in opening up more of my insides than I had ever thought I was capable of. There's a line you might have heard me say over the years, that Irish people have trouble using the first person even in therapy. So for me to write a memoir where I was writing about my childhood in a Dublin pub and my father's alcoholism and romance, failed romance, IVF, all of that, you might think, why? What would have possessed a person to do that? I think that part of the moment we're in right now is we have to draw more people into public service. And to write a policy book or a kind of stilted exterior account of what public service is like, or what diplomacy is like, or what trying to promote human rights is like, I hope that I would have had some readers in doing such a thing, but they would not see themselves, their foibles, their vulnerabilities in a story told in silhouette. And I realized, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, But when we read memoirs from people in public life, generally, of course, they're by men, particularly those related to foreign policy or national security, but also they're defenses of their actions rather than confessions of their mistakes or their vulnerabilities, and thus the extent to which one sees oneself in that person is much more limited.
Right.
And so I thought, particularly given that we need many more young girls and young women to feel that there's a place for them in making the change that they seek, to just lay it bare seemed a better approach. And that's been the most heartening dimension of going around and talking to people at a time when people are kind of saying, I want to get involved, but I don't know if I can. But it kind of creates an accessibility to the journey rather than some kind of reified, resume or something, which is sometimes what these kinds of accounts devolve into. So that was the logic of opening it up. That even if other working parents, for example, weren't negotiating a couple years ago with the Russian ambassador, they can identify with my young son Declan trying to get my attention when I was on the phone with Secretary Kerry talking about sanctions against Russia, and my son's trying to get my attention, and I'm shooing him away. And even though, again, very few mothers would have had exactly this experience, when my son Declan marched away saying, Putin, 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 when is it going to be Declan, 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 Declan? There's not one working parent who hasn't had a version of that experience, even though Putin was probably not the person being cursed by their child as they lamented the parental overstretch. But so that's the idea, is to open all of this up, and frankly to make it more attractive, because our American diplomatic corps has been completely ravaged. Again, if we only protest and don't turn that into involvement in civic change, we're not going to get where we need to get. So that was the hope and all that. About the Russian ambassador, it's related really, because I think that there's something so binary about our portrayals of geopolitics, but also domestic politics. And the truth is, life is complicated and people are complicated. The people that you want to tear your hair out over are also people who might have an irreverent sense of humor that you find very compelling. The Russian ambassador to the UN was defending Russia's aggression in Aleppo, in Ukraine, denying Russia's involvement in the US presidential election in 2016. At the same time, he was working with me privately to try to get Syrian political prisoners out of jail and to get humanitarian aid to pockets of northern Syria that hadn't been reached in many, many months. At the same time, he was trying to get the Russian government to agree to send peacekeepers, or at least observers, to various trouble spots in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you make any one of us, myself included, the sum of the worst thing that we do, or the biggest mistake that we've made, or even the sum of some role that we are playing, and don't at least try to draw water from the stone, I think we're just going to be at loggerheads and devolve into, even inside our own democracies, almost a Cold War mentality where everything is black on one side and white on the other, a very binary and unconstructive way of being. That said, there were some times where even seeing his humanity, didn't mean that I could spend time with him, because what he was defending was, I found so abhorrent. And so it's not as if, even though I can preach this, that it's always easy to execute. But I knew I couldn't achieve anything for my humanitarian goals or human rights goals or for US interests if I just wrote off Russia. Yeah. They hold a veto on the Security Council. And so I tried to find those strands of shared interests and shared humanity.
By the way, that leads to my next question. I want to talk a little bit more about the question of being an insider and an outsider. So I'm a journalist, and I love the freedom and the flexibility and the nimbleness that comes with that. But there's always this moment where you're standing outside a closed door, or where someone's reading basically a press release, and you wish with all your heart that you could be in the inside. And you did that for all of us, really. You were a journalist and a human rights activist, and you still are. And now you're also a real insider, or you were rather, in the Obama administration. So I was wondering if having all of these different perspectives made you better or maybe worse in the other arenas? That is, did being an activist make you a better diplomat, or did being a diplomat make you a better activist or a journalist or a writer? And in a way, that's the journey you're referring to in the book's title, which is The Education of an Idealist. But how did that play out? If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think in retrospect, it was moments like the one that you describe of being outside that door, the room where it happens, that probably planted in me a desire to be inside. Like you, sort of out of curiosity on one level, but also out of a sense of sometimes the limits of journalism, where you end up, in my case and in yours as well, describing mass atrocities or the harms caused by conflict, sexual violence against women and girls, and you just feel, okay, I'm writing this down, but is it making any difference? Is anybody doing anything about this? Is anything deterred? Is anything acted upon? So I think it was both those dynamics that probably left.
You say, which I love, that you were always writing for someone on the inside to read what you were writing and do something about it. And then
it was. I mean, I write in the book, as you know, about just being a journalist and being very sort of preternaturally instrumental about it. I think it was never kind of craft for craft's sake. I maybe didn't have the gifts to be some great literary giant, but very much thinking, ooh, I wonder if Bill Clinton will open his Washington Post and he'll see my article about what's happening in Bosnia and be moved by that. And in a way, it's sort of the presumptuousness of youth at work. But later, it did start to feel a little inefficient. I just thought, well, Danna can be writing the article, and then I can be in the room, and I can read it, and then maybe we can see if the government and the UN and the world.
Did that angle inform you and make you better? I mean, was being a journalist helpful in being a diplomat? And now that you're back outside writing and teaching, is having been in the inside teaching you a lot? Are you better at that?
I definitely think I was better in government for having gone through the rites of passage associated with learning how to be a journalist and a war correspondent. For starters, great skepticism about authority, which didn't go away when I had a badge around my neck with my name and photo on it. I mean, just wondering, well, how do you know this? And, if the intelligence community is presenting you some finding or claiming that counterterrorism cooperation with some abusive regime is delivering great security, really just wanting to question that and to know what is the evidentiary basis for that claim. There are just a lot of assertions in real life, and there are a lot of assertions in the Situation Room and elsewhere. So that skepticism, I think, I definitely carried with me. I always wanted to be in the field when I was in government for 8 years, first as the president's human rights advisor and then as UN ambassador. I just never had a full sense that I knew what was happening, without going there. And of course, then when you go, you realize, even less than you thought you knew. But at least you tend to be able to gather ideas from people on the ground who've really thought about what kinds of steps would improve conditions, or at a minimum, you might meet a single family that you can help navigate through the refugee process, for example. So that was helpful. And then lastly, and this was most at play when I was UN ambassador, storytelling. I mean, there's a tendency among government officials and diplomats to just, read the talking points and kind of, again, make a set of assertions, think that what's obvious to you is going to be obvious to someone else. But what a journalist and a storyteller brings is a recognition that you have to grip your audience. You have to meet them where they are. So they've heard this story 100 times before. They've already given up on being able to make a difference. You have to kind of puncture the bubble and the isolation from human consequences that sadly exists even at places like the UN, which are dedicated to providing humanitarian assistance. It's still a bubble. It's still so removed from people who are suffering the effects of decisions and non-decisions. So for me, that meant sometimes telling someone else's story myself. So debriefing somebody and then just using my remarks at the Security Council to give that individual the floor, just use my voice to amplify their voice. But sometimes it actually meant just bringing people into the Security Council who and have them speak for themselves. And that's one of the things we did during the Ebola crisis, which people are looking back at now in light of the mishandling of the current pandemic. But bringing a health worker from Liberia, who was the person who had to just turn away dozens and dozens of his neighbors every day who were coming to try to deposit their children at the clinic, but there were no beds at the clinic, and having him talk about what that would be like to turn a parent away who then has to lay their child at the entrance to the clinic, and the parent gets back in the cab and you know that the parent is going to bring the infection back to his entire family. Imagine, I mean, I'll get choked up telling the story now. Imagine to have him tell that story and then be the one to make the appeal to the world to step up and to unite and to help Liberia build more Ebola treatment clinics so that parents wouldn't be turned away in that way. I mean, it's just, but that's journalism at its best too. It's bringing that humanity to and bridging those distances in ways that are really hard to do without stories.
I'm going to get back to the Ebola in a minute. I wanted to I'm pretty sure that you have not managed to have any interview or talk about your book or even go to a dinner party since leaving the UN if people didn't start asking you about Syria, talking about what you can do from the outside, what you can do from the inside. And you in the book are really honest about this shadow that Syria has cast on your time at the UN, and you bring in the voices of your harshest critics, to your credit, and those that said you should resign, or those that said, how do you sleep at night? And I really recommend that people read the Syria chapters in the book for a way to look at how policy happens or doesn't happen, and for those of us journalists, shows what's going on behind those proverbial closed doors. But my question to you here is not so much what and how did the US policy happen, but more when you look back at it, what do you think about it today? How often do you think about what transpired in Syria? And what do you think you could or should have done differently or better there? Not Obama or the administration, but you.
I think about Syria still all the time. And I think about it these days also in the context of fearing that very few other people are thinking about it, even though the conflict is ongoing for people in Idlib and elsewhere, and for every Syrian who's been displaced and hasn't found their way home or who's lost somebody. I mean, this is a war. It's 9 years old, but it's going to last forever for people who survived it and are now dealing with the wreckage that is left. You asked the question, I think is the right question, which is, what could I have done differently? I look back, there were so many internal meetings where I made the case, for example, to really look much more seriously than I think we did at like a no-fly zone to protect pockets of civilians, at least, from the kind of air attacks that Bashar al-Assad was carrying out. I asked myself, could I, if I was less verbose, if I was pithier, if I had done a better job, building coalitions before various meetings started, so I had more people, chiming in on my behalf. I write in the book about the famous red line moment and what people the book in some ways makes news because I think people have come to believe that President Obama had no intention ever of enforcing the red line, when in fact we were 24 hours away from carrying out limited airstrikes on those airplanes and airfields that were involved in the chemical weapons attacks. They were mainly strikes that had been envisaged to deter future such chemical attacks. Again, very limited, not desiring to make war in Syria. But President Obama was really, really close to doing that. And I had one job, which was to get Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to withdraw the UN chemical weapons inspectors who were on the ground in Syria, looking into a set of previous smaller chemical weapons attacks, and then who had turned their attention to looking into this attack. And I failed to convince Ban Ki-moon to act on this request. Had the inspectors come out, Barack Obama most definitely would have carried out these limited airstrikes. Whether they would have changed the world, whether they could have jump-started our diplomacy, what that would have meant for the trajectory of the Syrian war, I don't know. But given how it has turned out with 500,000 people displaced, with mass migration throughout Europe that has changed the complexion of European politics, potentially been the pivotal factor in the Brexit vote, had an impact on the US election. All of that, that is something I look back and just say, could I have made a bigger difference?
By the way, I'm getting all these notes on the side saying we're almost done here. So I maybe people in the Q&A will want to ask more about that. But I just want to ask you a super important question to end our part of the conversation. And then there is going to be a Q&A. You were talking about the way you and the administration dealt with Ebola in 2014. And I had wanted to talk a little bit more about that, but I'm just going to quickly jump to the question, which has to do with looking at the way the US is handling the coronavirus right now and handling many other things, and looking at the world and the international arena and what's become of it right now in this moment. Do you think it's possible, but how is the US going to reestablish itself in the international arena in the years to come and reach a point where other countries want to work with the United States in the way they were to a great degree when you were there? And how are we going to repair the way the rest of the world sees us? Is that possible? And how's that going to happen? And we have a couple minutes to talk about that. And then we're going to switch to a Q&A, which people can maybe follow up or ask their own questions. But that was important to me because that's a question I walk around with all the time.
Yeah, indeed. Well, this is not the form of U.S. leadership that people wanted from the United States, to lead the world in corona deaths, to lead the world in corona infections. That's not leadership as we know it or as we wish it. And more than that, of course, alongside showing the dysfunction within our own democracy, which is not a great advertisement for democracy, and China and other countries have focused on that a great deal for propaganda purposes. But beyond that, to, of course, pull funding from the WHO at the height of a global pandemic. I mean, it's almost like an Onion headline of what you would do if you were trying to destroy your standing in the world. And also create a big vacuum that China is stepping in to fill. To repair it, massive humility for the next president, not rhetoric about going back to the way things were in 2017, January 20th, 2017. There is no going back. But remembering that there is strength in numbers and that democracies need to do a much better job building coalitions in order to make international institutions work in ways that democratic citizens also come to appreciate. I think we didn't do a good enough job selling what we were doing internationally and bringing it home for citizens who were pretty receptive to Trump's rhetoric that we were getting ripped off. So it's going to take an awful lot of digging out, but the exigencies, the demands of the world, the need to look out for our own citizens are going to require global cooperation. And I know from working at the UN, unfortunately, every group suffers from collective action problems, and you do need catalytic leadership. So I'm hopeful that with humility that we can, again, together brainstorm about what the best way to carve a new path in the 21st century is.
Thank you, Samantha. Wow, I have so many more questions, but I see Charlie there, and I think we're moving on to another
I hate to interrupt this conversation because that was absolutely riveting. We have a lot of questions actually that have come in, and we're going to bring those across to the breakout Q&A. So we're going to wrap things up for this first session. Thank you, Danna. Thank you, Samantha. That was brilliant. And we'll see you in the breakout Q&A very shortly. To everybody who's watching, if you go into the virtual CogX app, you can go to what's happening and you'll see the breakout Q&A session. And if you go in there, you'll be able to continue asking your questions as well. So thank you both, and we'll be back with you soon.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.